All right, first things first we're gonna do today is cut those spot welds that are holding those transmission mount plates to the frame, because it's got to move forward. This cross member has to move forward, so it goes underneath this transmission mount, so it's got to move forward a couple inches. And I'm also gonna move the mounts up a little bit, so I'm gonna have to re-drill those holes here. They have to go up a bit. The transmission is tilted down a little bit too much of an angle. It's around 3.5%, I'm sorry, 3.5 degrees down. I want it around 2.5. So not a big deal, but I'll bring those up a little bit so I don't have to put a shim under here to raise it. You can just set the mount right on the cross member, and I don't have to shim it up and down and worry about that. So I'll just re-drill a couple holes real quick. So pretty simple. I'll get after that real quick, get those cut out, and then pull it out, re-drill the holes up a bit. And I'm gonna weld some captured nuts on the back side. So right now, it's just a bolt, and then you just put a nut on the back. It's kind of hard to reach back behind there. So when I install it, I'm just gonna mock it up, and I'm gonna weld nuts on the back so that you can just through bolt it without having to hold it on the back, because you can kind of juggle in all this cross member, the transmission sitting on top of it when you're putting it in. So it'll be a lot easier just to bolt it in without having to hold the nut on the back and mess around with that. All right, I got the plates ground out and removed. That went pretty quick, no problems there. So what I did is then I just bolted up the cross member to the underside of the transmission, so we'll start to get it centered. So the big thing here is, right now, this hole was cut. This used to have a manual in it. So what I'm gonna do now is make sure that this transmission is centered in the tunnel. So right now it's, just eyeballing it straight. So I'll tape measure it from the frame rail to the side of the trans, frame rail side of the trans, and get it centered in here. And then I'll put the plates back in, just mocked up, mark the holes where they go, and get that all drilled out. So you can see before, that edge of the truss member was basically right at the edge of the frame. So that edge was sitting on this edge of the frame, so it's raised roughly an inch. And tape measure it yet, but so I did end up raising it about an inch to make the engine where I wanted it as far as level. It's angled down 2.5 degrees towards the rear, which is about standard. So let's get that. But first of all, everything has to get centered. The other thing is that the cross member, you can't see it, these holes are slotted sideways, so you can slide it back and forth. So all I'm gonna do for right now, just to center everything, is I'll measure from this edge to the center of the bolt hole and just make sure this is centered. So everything starts out center. So if it's a little bit off, 1/8 of an inch or whatever, when everything's in here, then I have a little adjustability here to slide it back and forth. So pretty slick. That allows for a little bit of error, just in welding it in here, trying to do everything upside down and clamp it all in here. It's gonna end up probably being a bit off, but that way I can accommodate any kind of shift that's in there. Plus, if there's an offset to the rear end, then you can accommodate it there too. So I'll get this all squared up and get the plates in and marked. All right, working on some centering. It raises some more questions than it really solves. So first of all, I went from the inside of this little bend to the center of the bolt and got this centered up at the dimensions 1.25 inches from each side. So that's centered, at least on the transmission mount. And then I measured, see if this will zoom out, from the frame rail to the center of the trans. We're lucky it's actually got this little casting mark here that looks like it's dead center in the middle of it, so just went there and got that going at 14.75 from here, both sides. Now you can see the problem is that now is 1 inch from hitting the frame rail. It's 1 inch from the inside of the frame where I could put those box plates, and this one is pushed in well inside. So this being done by another guy before I got it, who knows what dimension he used. I have no idea what he was trying to do. So I have no clue. So I'm going to take a look at the engine. I'm going to go around front and just see if it looks like it's laying in the engine bay straight. I'm going to make some marks, probably from the rear mounting ears of the block to the frame. Just see if it looks like it's straight. And if so, then I'll have to just cut these little spot welds off. Sorry. Cut those spot welds and just move those sleeves in and out to work, because it's just not going to work as is, obviously. So, but anyway, it's centered here, so that's the next step. All right, so now I'm around the back in the front of the motor looking at it. So you can just tell that, first of all, for the Crown Vic, it looks like it's offset. The motor is physically closer to the passenger side, the driver's side. So that tells me that it doesn't need to be centered in the tunnel because the engine isn't centered. So the tough part is trying to figure out, if it's not centered, then how do you figure out what angle, or how it's straight and parallel? Because there's not a lot of consistent things to measure to on the block, right? You know, there's not anything on the block is not going to work. So what I'm thinking is I'll just use head bolts, because that's, you know, that's a straight surface, or the edge of the head to the frame, which is straight until you get to here. Then it kicks back, it kind of narrows. So about here is about as close as you can get. So you want to get consistent here to here, and that will make sure that the engine's straight in the frame. It's the only way I can think to do it. So coming over here, same thing, a little tougher because it's actually closer. You can see this distance is closer, but try to get it consistent from the frame to the head, get that all straightened out. Then you're set. You know, then it doesn't matter. It's not going to be centered in the tunnel, but again, the engine's not centered in the frame, basically, now with the Crown Vic on here. Sorry, the Crown Vic front end mounting it. So I'll take some measurements, try to get this thing straightened out, and then I'll come back through and kind of show what I ended up with. All right, just continue to work on trying to get this thing centered, this engine centered. And I think I wasn't really thinking logically. You can't really use the side of the engine because it's tilted down. So naturally, whatever this dimension is, if you're going from the frame to the front of the engine, because it's tilted down, it naturally changes. So you're not going to be able to figure out if it's parallel because it's also tilted down. There's two axes, whatever you want to call it, two planes. So starting to think about it, you usually generally work from crankshaft center line for anything. First I was thinking about cylinder heads, but they're offset. So crankshaft center line is usually a standard, you know, in height and just for setting the angle. So thinking about it, it's square to the block. So if you extend that off the pulley, assuming these are good pulleys and everything's square as far as the pulley, then you can use that, and then you have to have a set reference on the frame, which I know from measuring before, this hole to this hole is square left and right. So that's a set, you know, constant. So by extending this dimension over to here, should be the same side to side if this thing's nice and parallel, and it is. So I just wiggle it around until I got it. I think it's 9 1/8. So I think that's how we're going to do it. I'll try and figure out some other way, but I think for right now that looks pretty good. And again, once it's set in there, you can adjust it with that cross member in the back quite a bit. You know, those slots are around 3/4 of an inch. So unless I can figure out another way to check the dimension that's good and square for now, I'll go ahead and look at the back and see where that ended up as far as being offset in the frame, because as you saw before, it was 1 inch off. So the way I had to push it to center up, you know, to make this dimension true, it was fixing that and putting it back where the cross member was going to be able to catch the frame rail. So I think we're going to be good. All right, doing a final fit up on the, well, not really final, but get more fit up on the transmission cross member. So I got the engine and transmission in here parallel to the frame, not centered in the cross member because it's offset, but parallel now, so we're all good. So when I did that and set it in here, you look at the cross member, you can see that now the end of this is inside the frame rail because we slid it all over. So now I have to cut off that amount of the cross member to be able to mount it flush. I want it flush with here. I don't want it inset. It's just going to look goofy and it's going to be harder to mount in there. And then because we slid it over, this side is actually a little bit shy, but luckily there's enough sleeve where I can just bring this out and still catch the plate that's gonna sit in here. So not too bad. Just first things first, I just need to cut off that end and then get this all mocked back up in here. Just can't mock it up until that end's pulled off. So go ahead and do that and put it all back in here. All right, got some modifications done to these plates. Again, so these plates are the weld on the inside of the frame, crossmember bolts to them. These are the old holes. These are 1 inch higher now because the transmission was at too much of a downward, the engine and transmission were at too much of a downward angle. They were at 4.5 degrees down. That's too much, so raise it up 1 inch, and that brought it up to about 2.5, which is perfect. So easy enough there. And then all I did was weld these capture nuts on the back, because before you would have to hold that nut, try to throw in the thread in the bolt while you're holding the transmission and the transmission cross member all at once. It was a handful, so way easier to just be able to thread the bolts in. You don't have to hold the back side. So easy enough. I'll go ahead and mock that all up underneath the truck, and then I can go ahead and tack weld these plates in. And then once that's done, I'll have to put the rest of the cross member in. Remember, that slides inside this sleeve, and tack weld that, but it's a couple different steps we'll have to take. So first things first, get this mocked up underneath the truck. All right, we're all finalized here. So the plates are tacked in. They're nice and flush with the edge of the frame. Before they were offset inside. I don't know why, but it was kind of ugly. These sleeves are bolted in through those capture nuts in the back, and then I just tack welded the cross member to it. Everything looks good. It fit up real nice and easy. This side's done, so at least that's all done. So once I take the cab off, then we'll do all the final welding. I'll take this cross member out and weld it up, but everything looks good, nice and level. And on to the next